You're not afraid of the dark, are you?
It's the sound of your death.
We keep heaven packed with fresh souls.
The peak of your civilization.
It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity.
You're an errand boy.
Good tidings, my truth seekers. This is Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis. Or more like Coffee, Coffin Nails, and Gnosis, as Robert Price calls it. This is your life. Don't play hard to get. This is your eternal dark odyssey through the gnashing rocks of orthodoxy. This is your revolution to awaken the God within you and make sure Hypatia makes it home this time.
I'm a leaf on the wind. Watch how I soar.
This is your incessant exploration of the world's favorite and least known heretics, the Gnostics, and their brethren in the Esoterica. So on this October 22nd, 2006, light up your cigarettes, cigars, or bowls. Light up some incense if you have to. I hear sage is really good for cleaning up the spirits in your room. And make sure you've got fuel in your cup because
coffee's for closers only.
And we're gonna burn, my true seekers. One way or another, we're gonna burn. So set the controls for the heart of the sun. My name is still Miguel Connor, otherwise known as your host, Abraxas, the terrible god above God as the ancients knew him, and the name where we get the word abracadabra. So all of humanity has called upon Abraxas in some aspect or another.
I am the devil.
Last week's skit, our parody of the destruction of the virtual Alexandria and takeover by Jehovah, was quite a success, I must tell you. Both my emails and Skype phone were constipated with accolades. Here is one example for you.
I feel like I'm taking crazy pills!
Okay, here, let me play another example from my Skype answering machine.
I just hate you, and I hate your ass face!
And even Demi Moore, who I have parodied before on Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis, is now a big fan, as you will see by this message.
Suck my dick!
Woo! Good stuff. But behind all humor, there is a kernel of tomb-like gravity. As my design director and guardian angel Rose showed me soon thereafter, there is actually a god named Yahoo. This is from a research from the various online encyclopedias. Let me read what she found out. There was a temple named the Temple of Yahoo, described in the Aramaic letters speaking of the temple at Elephantine. God is being referred to as Yahoo from at least before 407 BC. The temple of Elephantine and the temple at Jerusalem were referred to as the Temple of Yahoo. This temple at Elephantine was destroyed in 410 BC by other priests of the god Canub in Egypt. The reconstruction of the temple referred to in Ezra and Nehemiah was contributed to by the Hebrews at the Temple of Elephantine circa 419-400 BC. We do know that the name Yahoo was used at the beginning of the 4th century BC after the return of the exiles and at the construction of the temple at Jerusalem. Okay, so it's probably more than likely that Yahoo is actually a mispronunciation of Iao, I-A-O, one of the names of God and also one of the names of Abraxas. In my depictions, you can see the inscription of Iao on my shield. Ah, that astral web just keeps spreading across our universes, eh? Who knows? Maybe the demiurge is working through me on a subconscious level. Maybe my Gnostic renaissance is just a trap for you true seekers into a world of delirium and madness. Maybe freedom and egalitarian are just sighs of a passing dreamscape. Nah, I'm the real deal.
I won't lead you astray. I promise I'll pull out before it's too late.
Okay, the reality is that part of remembering our true selves is also peeling away at our counterfeit selves. You know, the layers spackled on us by families' collective psychosis, religious institutions, societal expectations, Maimon-like goals and the other lullabies of the angelic mafia. You just can't turn your back on orthodoxy.
See, it's no good, Monty. We've all got to be alike. The only way to be happy is for everyone to be made equal.
Like I've said before, saying I'm a Gnostic or I'm an atheist or whatever doesn't mean you still aren't the sweet-cheeked altar boy of Jehovah. As soon as you turn your back on the God of this world, he will dig his long claws into your back.
We may be through with the past, but the past ain't through with us.
And soon you'll be just as infected with self-righteousness, arrogance, ignorance, pride, and insecurity as when you were a conscious slave of the demiurge. So it's a process of vigilant recalling and vigilant deconstructing. Today we deconstruct the historical Jesus in a meticulous and measured way. We leave barely any stones unturned, and if we do, it's because they've been unturned in past shows. Or actually turned. The truth is that the Orthodox Jesus is just as much of a myth as the Gnostic Jesus, except the former became a poisonous dogma that has been garroting the human imagination for the last 2,000 years.
Cruelty and injustice, intolerance and oppression, and where once you had the freedom to object, to think and speak as you saw fit, you now have censors and systems of surveillance coercing your conformity and soliciting your submission.
We need cameras.
How did this happen? Who's to blame? Well, certainly there are those who are more responsible than others, and they will be held accountable. But again, truth be told, if you're looking for the guilty, you need only look into a mirror. I know why you did it. I know you were afraid. Who wouldn't be? War, terror, disease. There were a myriad of problems which conspired to corrupt your reason and rob you of your common sense. Fear got the best of you, and in your panic you turned to the now High Chancellor Adam Sutler. He promised you order, he promised you peace, and all he demanded in return was your silent, obedient consent.
Joseph Campbell once said, "Religion is myth misunderstood." Let us understand the myth, the rather weak myth that is the Orthodox Jesus. Once that is accomplished, then we can truly appreciate and get lost like children in the fable of Christ in ways that will nurture our spirits and take us down the waterfall of gnosis. Whoa! Our guest today is Dr. James Gardner, author of Jesus Who? Myth versus Reality in the Search for the Historical Jesus. He is also the editor of the excellent website, JesusPolice.com, which just isn't about his research on the historical Jesus, but an interactive site where you can offer input or take a stand for your own "Who is Jesus?" theory. Furthermore, it's a site charged with scholarly information, links, and references on everything you ever wanted to know about Jesus but were afraid to ask Pat Robertson.
And may the Christian Lord guide my hand!
James's biography reads like a book on its own. Such are his accomplishments, both literary and professionally. So if you want to know more about our guest, please visit JesusWho.net. It's quite a read. So think about deconstruction, my true seekers, because that is part of your ascent into fulfilling your divine heritage. I am, and I am Abraxas, but so is each one of you beyond the serfdom of time and space. As Hermann Hesse put it in his novel Damien, the bird struggles out of the egg. The egg is the world. Whoever wants to be born must first destroy a world. The bird flies to God. That God's name is Abraxas. So enough of my drivel. On to the interview. During your search, what would you say was the most shocking thing you discovered about the historical Jesus?
I wasn't a very religious person. I'm not a very religious person. So I didn't know all that much about Jesus, but I very soon found out that everything I knew was wrong. As a matter of fact, everything that everybody knows about Jesus turns out to be wrong. There's almost, when you go into the history and you begin to delve into it, almost everything that we believe today about Jesus is part of a myth or part of propaganda or just part of foolishness, sheer foolishness that has come down through the ages to become part of the thing we think is the story of Jesus. And there were so many things, like when he was born, or how old he was when he died, or what he looked like. All of those things were surprising. So I don't think any one thing struck me with awe as much as the total misrepresentation struck me. And then there were lots of other things. I think probably the one that I'm still struck with is the way he looked. You know, if you think of the way, if you say to people, what did Jesus look like, you get, oh, it's Max von Sydow, or it's,
right.
You know, it's the blonde hair, blue eye, long hair. And then from all the research I did, which was quite extensive on going back to paintings and tombs and little amulets on rings and discussions, it turns out, in fact, that Jesus is a short guy. He's not particularly attractive. He's got short hair, and he's clean-shaven. That is almost, if you can have any certainty, you can't have certainty when you're researching someone who lived 2,000 years ago. But if you can have any certainty at all, I'm pretty sure that's what he looked like. And a short guy with unattractive, with short hair and clean-shaven, where the heck did that come from? And so I think that was the one that struck me as the strangest misrepresentation.
I always thought it strange when I read the Talmud that said that Moses was hideous, but that was in the Talmud. What are some of the sources that point at Jesus not being the handsome fellow in the Passion of the Christ of Jesus of Nazareth?
Some people have argued, and it may be true, that the references to Jesus not being particularly attractive come from Old Testament prophecies which maintain that as a result of carrying the sins of the world, Jesus would become hideous looking. For example, in the Acts of Peter, Peter says, "And when we saw him, and he had no beauty nor comeliness." Or in the Acts of John, John says, "And oft times he," this is referring to Jesus, "would appear to me as a small man and uncomely." In Celsus, this is a little bit later, he describes Jesus as literally, quote now, "small and ugly and undistinguished." I could go on. There's just three sites about him being unattractive. Now, some people have said, well, what they're really doing is transposing an Old Testament prophecy that the suffering servant would be made ugly because taking on all the sins of the world. That would be true, except Jesus doesn't fit the profile of the suffering servant. Although that's the common perception, that's a misperception. So I'm inclined to believe, therefore, that, you know, if every reference we have to Jesus' physical appearance is that he wasn't attractive, then I'm inclined to believe that he wasn't attractive. And it doesn't really matter, you know, whether you're religious. I look at it from a historical point of view. But it shouldn't upset a religious person either, because Jesus' attractiveness, his long hair, his clean-shaven or not, none of those things really should matter.
Right, and you also point out in your book that looking at coinage, famous figures including several Herods and Simon Bar Kokhba, that the style was the Roman style of wearing your beard and hair.
Yes, that was the style, and when later on in the Renaissance, well, even in around the 4th and 5th century, once the people who began drawing pictures of Jesus, the first people doing that on a widespread basis were the people from Byzantium. And once the Catholic Church, or I guess the Christian Church at that point, moved from Rome to Byzantium, and about that time they started producing lots of drawings about Jesus. Well, guess what the people in Byzantium look like? They got long hair and long beards. So how did they paint Jesus? Long hair, long beards. Later, when the Catholics in the Renaissance, a lot of whom were anti-Semitic, started portraying the Jews, everybody got portrayed like that. But when you go back into the 1st century, well, actually you can't go into the 1st century, but into the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and you see what he looked like in the graves in Rome, under the streets, the Christian tombs, or you look at the coinage, you see very clearly that he's portrayed with like a Marine, with short hair and no beard. And somewhere in Paul, too, Paul also mentions that it's an abomination to have long hair. So you can be pretty sure that if Jesus were walking down the street today, nobody would recognize him. He was this little ugly guy that just got out of the Marines, and it just wouldn't look like Jesus.
Not the hippie view. In your book, you point out that the Jesus cult more than likely originated from the various Joshuas in the 1st century BC and 1st century AD. Could you tell the listeners of some of the most famous or infamous of these Joshuas running around Palestine?
Jesus' name, his name wasn't Jesus Christ. The first name wasn't Jesus. The last name wasn't Christ. His name, if you were his buddy in Galilee, you would have said, yo, Joshua, or even Yeshua. Those were the Aramaic or the Greek and Hebrew words. This Jesus is a later translation. So when we're trying to see who at that time, nobody was named Jesus. Their names were Joshua. And there were several people at that time who took the name Jesus. Now, what became Joshua? What became pretty apparent to me is that the Jesus that we read about in the New Testament really consists of portraits of several of these Joshuas who lived at that time. There's not a single Jesus that they're talking about. In fact, because the Gospels really aren't written down until the middle of the 2nd century, which is 100 years after this particular Jesus dies. By that time, there are lots of oral stories about, oh, Joshua, he did this, and, oh, yeah, Joshua did that. And I think what happened is as they got down to writing them down, all these Joshuas blended together. And you have to realize in those days, people didn't have last names. People generally had first names. And so Jesus' name would have been not Jesus Christ, but his name would have been Yeshua ben Yosef, Yeshua the son of Joseph. So you could see on that basis there'd be lots of Yeshuas or Joshuas floating around, and they may all have been blended together. The most famous Joshua is this guy called Joshua ben Stada, who is often referred to also as Joshua ben Pantera, and he lived about 100 years before the traditional Jesus was born. He is probably the most interesting of the characters, but there are other characters. Now, I'm going to give you a very brief portrait of this guy and see if this doesn't sound a little bit familiar to you. He was a disciple of a famous holy man. He went to go study with him. His mother's name was Mary. People said that his father was a Roman soldier who had led Mary astray. He went to Egypt. He was persecuted by the Pharisees. He learned magic. He had some significant things happen to him at an inn. He had a quarrel with his mentor and established his own cult or sect and gathered with him some discipline, some disciples. One of those guy's name is Matthew. Eventually, the Jews accused him of practicing black magic and deceiving people and leading Israel astray. He's tried. False witnesses come to the trial, and then he's killed on the eve of Passover. Sound familiar?
Very much, very much.
But that's not our Jesus. That's the Jesus who lived 100 years before the Jesus who we all think of as the Jesus. And there are dozens more. There's Joshua ben Sirach, who was famous for the book of Sirach. It's part of the Apocrypha in the Old Testament and has lots of wisdom sayings that are very similar to Jesus' saying. There's Joshua ben Gamala, and he was a well-known rebel and a peace activist. He was put to death by the Romans. There's Joshua ben Aninus, and he was known for prophesying particularly the destruction of the temple. And he also preached the end of times, etc. So there are a whole bunch of these guys floating around from around 100 BC right up until 70 AD. And I think when you read the Gospels and you see, well, isn't that funny that Jesus said this, but he also said that? It looks like it's almost a different person. I think the reason for that is by the time the Gospels are written down in the 2nd century, these stories are just floating out there. People say, tell me something else about Joshua, and they put all these stories down and they make one composite person out of him, which is why it becomes very difficult when you're looking for the historical Jesus, try to isolate any one person in that.
Then another thing that kind of made me hit myself on the head, a very obvious one, but he should have never been called Jesus of Nazareth, but he should have been called Jesus of Bethlehem, right?
Actually, should have been called neither one of them. What he was called is he was called Jesus the Nazarene. Who the Nazarenes were, they were a sect, goes back to the 2nd century BC, was and continued on after Jesus. Some people say it came from the Persian Empire and was heavily influenced by Zoroastrianism, and they were ascetics just like Jesus was. They were very religious groups. Some people actually think that the Essenes are part of the Nazarenes, and there is some linguistic similarities when you go back to the before BC era and you look at some of the language that's used to describe these groups. They may even be the same groups, and he's called Jesus the Nazarene. But when they get around to translating this in the 2nd century, they mistranslate it, like they do so many things. There are dozens of things they mistranslate. This is another one, and what they come up with is Jesus the Nazarene must mean he's from Nazareth. The reason they do that is when they're writing the Gospels in the 2nd century, there is a town called Nazareth. But the archaeological fact is, at the time that Jesus is born, a place called Nazareth, as described in the Gospels, doesn't exist. What it is, it's a little place in the road. There's a creek there, and there's some people who live in caves, and an occasional camel jockey comes by and stops there. That's all it is. There is no town. There is no synagogue. There are not hundreds of people there. It doesn't exist. And the best archaeologists who have done research on that, including Crowson and Reed and Bugatti and everybody who's been in the area and done their homework, will tell you that the signs of Nazareth as an occupied village really don't happen. The latest they can go back is the middle of the 1st century, which is 70 years after Jesus is supposed to have been there. So he wasn't, he wasn't from Nazareth. He was Jesus the Nazarene, and that's a mistake they made, just like they made the mistake translating Mary, who was a young girl. They translate that as a virgin, and they make lots of translation problems like that. So he's not from Nazareth, but he's not from Bethlehem either. Bethlehem is part of the desire of the people who wrote the Gospels in order to make Jesus, to establish his link to the Old Testament. And that sounds like it's a funny thing to do, but in those days, that's how they defined history. They weren't so concerned with facts the way we use them today, but for them a fact consisted of finding a prophecy in the Old Testament which foreshadowed something happening later. That was a fact. And in the Old Testament there's a lot of stuff about Bethlehem, So Luke and Matthew come up with their nativity stories, and they send him to Bethlehem. And in both cases, when you read it pretty closely, it's an obvious fabrication. For example, they have him going to Bethlehem in order to register for a census. Well, of course, everybody listening to your program probably knows that there was no census in 6 BC when Jesus was born. It's in 6 AD is the first census. Problem number one. Problem number two, people, when they had a census, people registered where they lived. Nobody went back to where they were born to be registered. You were registered where you lived. So the whole idea of Joseph and Mary and a pregnant Mary going to Bethlehem is pure silliness. They didn't have to. They would have registered wherever it was they lived. It's even sillier when you consider the fact that the person required to register was the man. A wife didn't register, and no one in their right mind would bring a pregnant wife with them on a trip from Galilee to Bethlehem. Would have taken a week, would have exposed them to heat and rough terrain and robbers. There were robbers all over the place in those days. And so the idea that Joseph would take a pregnant Mary, much less even an unpregnant Mary, with him on a trip like that is just sheer silliness.
Yeah, I always tell people, imagine if we had to do a census in the United States and all of us had to go to our hometown, this whole country would fall apart. That would happen. It would be the same thing in the Roman Empire, right?
Exactly the same thing. They were just as dispersed as we are, and it's just not what happened. So, it's just both the idea that he's from Nazareth or Bethlehem are just mistakes, errors made for different reasons. To some extent, these guys are sitting down, the guys who write these Gospels, they're sitting down in the middle of the 2nd century, and they're trying to come up with a story, and the basis of their story is the Old Testament. So they're trying to say, okay, what do we see in the Old Testament that we can make Jesus' life conform to? And they're just going down the list, and, oh, look, over here it says Bethlehem. Okay, let's put him in Bethlehem. Over here it says suffering servant. Okay, he's a suffering servant. You can just see them sitting down there. One guy's sitting down with the Old Testament, the other guy's writing it, and he's saying, okay, you got to have a scene. It's like in Hollywood with scriptwriters. You got to have a scene in which the hero does this. And nowadays we take it from our collective media. In those days they took it from the Old Testament. So that's how you get a lot of this silliness in there.
And why do you think Mark didn't even bother with the birth or formative years of Jesus?
Well, I think for Mark, who I believe Mark is the first of those Gospels, of the typical canonical Gospels. I believe his is probably the first one written. It's certainly the one that seems to be the most, got the least of these crazy things in it. And I think for him, it's clear that the end times, the escalon, the end of days, near. And for the people who believe that, there was really, it didn't matter where he was born or his childhood or anything like that. It actually didn't matter much to Jews of that era about child rearing and all that kind of stuff. It didn't matter. Most of the central characters and most of the maturity was associated with age 30. It's when you could become a rabbi. It's many of the biographies of people in those times begin at age 30. So it's not surprising that, and Luke has him preaching at age 30. But for Mark, what's important is his preaching that the end of times is here. It didn't matter where he was born, none of those things. What mattered was his teaching. I think that's why it's left out in Mark, although, some people say there is a version of Mark, it's called Secret Mark, that was lost and of which only little bits and pieces were ever found. So it may even be that there is a version of Mark somewhere that someday somebody will discover that does have it. The one we have doesn't have the birth stories. And
so, James, later on, why was it important to, second century Christians to have the virgin birth when there probably was no virgin birth?
Well, I think a number of things came into play, and you can see this in the Jewish writings, for example. In the middle of the in the beginning and the middle of the second century, after Paul's writings and some of the very early Christian writings, and Jesus and the story of Jesus begins to come into the air, the Jews also have stories about Jesus. And their story about Jesus is the story of the fellow we talked about earlier, Pantera or Stada. He had both those names. And in that story, Jesus is the son of an adulterous union between Mary and a Roman soldier, the guy named Pantera. Curiously enough, 1,800 years later, they find a grave in Germany of a Roman soldier named Pantera. It wasn't an uncommon name. So this story is circulating in the early second century, and the Jews are saying, you know, your Savior, not only is he not a Savior, but his mother was an adulterer. He didn't even have a father. He's cursed. So that's in the air. And you can see in the writings, particularly of Matthew, but you see it also in Luke and John, to some extent, they are answering criticisms of the extant community that's out there. And I think one of those criticisms is that Jesus is an illegitimate child of Mary's adultery, and therefore they decide to clarify that, and they go one step further. They give him, they say, not only is this not adulterous, but this is, you know, a virgin birth, because virgin births were very well in keeping to the audience they were writing for. Generally speaking, they're writing for a Christian or maybe even a pagan audience, and amongst the pagan audiences, you got to have a virgin birth. You know, that's just part of, you couldn't be a big guy, you couldn't be a really important person unless you had a virgin birth. Plato had a virgin birth.
Yeah. Alexander the Great
had a virgin birth. Buddha had a virgin birth.
Yeah.
You could just go down the list. Mishnah, Krishnas, all these people had virgin births. So now in the second century, when the gospel writers are counteracting the Jewish slander and rewriting or writing for the first time Jesus' birth, they decide, okay, listen, if he's a savior and all these other pagan saviors have virgin births, we'll give him a virgin birth.
Yeah, and one of the smoking guns you use, which I'd never heard before, in proving Mary wasn't a virgin, was in the Gospel of Luke. She goes through a purification rite right after her birth. James, could you explain more about this tradition, this purification rite?
Kind of goes back, you know, the Jews as a people had lots of funny little things that they did. And probably in its time, it made sense because of diseases. And so they had all kinds of laws and purification rituals, and you eat this food with that food, and you go here and you can't touch this and you can't touch that. And they had lots and lots of rules, I think over 600 actually, rules that they were supposed to follow. And there were two of them. Luke kind of gets it wrong. They had two different procedures. He, because he's neither Jewish nor is he writing near the time that these things are practiced, he kind of combines the two of them into one big ceremony, when in fact there are two different procedures. There's the one in Leviticus, which is purification, and then there's the one in Numbers or Exodus, which is the presentation of the firstborn. They're different, but when he puts them together, he makes them all sound as if they're one. The purification ritual is done when 40 days after the woman has given birth, and they go to the temple and they make a a sacrifice of a lamb, or 2 doves, or it could be 2 pigeons, or it could be a dove and a pigeon. Pick one from column A, one from column A. It's kind of a variety of things you can do for this purification ritual. And as a matter of fact, it's the purification. Some people have argued in the purification ritual, which Luke gets wrong, although he's got it there. That's used as a basis for arguing that Jesus' family was poor because they couldn't afford a lamb and they only had 2 pigeons. So that was pretty pathetic, and therefore Jesus is poor. But from what I've read of the Jewish history at the time, that tradition from Leviticus was really an Old Testament and a BC before Christ tradition. So it's not so clear that giving 2 pigeons is a sign of poverty, and that's another one of the myths about Jesus' family, because in fact you can tell from Jesus is obviously a highly educated person. He quotes from the Old Testament, and he quotes, as far as we can see, he knows it better than anybody else. What that means is he had an excellent education, and there was no way that a poor carpenter living in a no-name village in Galilee would ever be able to have that kind of education. So it's pretty clear that Jesus had a good education, and therefore his family wasn't poor. But just to get back to the purification ritual, had the birth been virgin birth, there would be no need for a purification ceremony.
Right, and since we're talking about Jesus standing in society, you give 2 reasons why he, 2 additional reasons why he wasn't poor, and one was the word for carpenter might be mistranslated, and the wedding at Cana, where somehow Jesus and his mother can afford, well, slaves.
Yeah, servants. She's at a wedding, and she's bossing around servants. Well, you know, that means 2 things. One, they can't be poor if they have servants. But also, number 2, many people have said this suggests that that's Jesus' wedding. And of course, it's only in the Gospel of John, so, you know, did it happen? Why isn't it in the other Gospels? There's lots of questions which you can, and those are questions that you have to raise with all the Gospels, because these stories don't necessarily appear in all of them. But, you know, taking that into account, the wedding at Cana seems to indicate, and why would Jesus seems to indicate, you know, that Jesus is there with other rich people, so obviously they're not poor. The mother is bossing servants around and telling them what to do, so it suggests that she has servants. They are reasonably well off, and it also suggests maybe this is Jesus' wedding.
Why does it suggest it's the wedding of Jesus? What was the tradition back then?
Well, because they seem to be hosting it. So what they call the governor of the feast, today we call it the DJ, I guess. The governor of the feast goes over to her and to him and says, hey, folks, we're out of wine. You know, we just, what are we going to do? Well, within Jewish traditions of that time, you wouldn't be bothering your guests with that kind of information. That's the problem of the host. And sure enough, Mary says, hey, Jesus, you know, get off the stick. And he says, hey, you talking to me? And, you know, she says, go fix it. And he fixes the problem. You have to look at it this way. Here's Jesus, if you believe he's a miracle worker, and he creates miracles. That's a pretty shoddy miracle to be creating. I mean, it's one thing to raise somebody from the dead.
Get the guys drunk. Yeah, let's get the guys drunk.
Yeah, let's get the guys drunk. You know, hey, beer for everybody. You know, that's kind of somehow, if he's a savior and etc., you know, I want more substantial miracles. Heal the lame, make the blind see. What are you doing getting these guys drunk? It doesn't make sense as a miracle, and yet John says this is his first sign of power. Okay, well, if it's his wedding, it makes a lot more sense. So I think this is why people have argued it sounds from the description in John as if Jesus is talking originally as if this was Jesus' wedding. Now you can be sure by the time the scribes, the translators, got through with it, and we know this for a fact, they edited out lots of stuff that referred to Jesus' family. And this may just be another instance in which the original gospel had this as Jesus' marriage, and the guys who were writing it later wanted to keep the miracle but didn't want to have a married Jesus, because this creates all kinds of conflicts for the competing Christian groups. So they leave the miracle in and they edit out all the stuff to make it Jesus' marriage. And I think, quite frankly, that that's likely.
And why do you think the Gospels portray Jesus having such a tense relationship with his family outside of Joseph?
Yeah, I think that's all. It's all put in later by the writers, and they add things. You know, in John, for example, there's a passage in John in which Jesus says they're sitting around and they want to know, hey, should we go to Jerusalem or not? And the brothers say, yeah, you have to go to Jerusalem because you say you're a hotshot. People can only prove that they're a hotshot in Jerusalem. You need to go there, which sounds like pretty good brotherly advice. And then somebody puts in parentheses, even his brothers don't believe him. And you have to look at that in a couple of ways. In the first case, and I know the first time I read that, I thought, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why are they telling him to do that if they don't believe in him? That's a very funny thing. And why is it there in parentheses? Well, if you go back and you look at the parentheses, the use of parentheses in John, you'll see that they're almost all informative. He doesn't use, generally speaking, a parentheses to introduce material like that. And what I concluded and what other people have concluded, generally speaking, is that parentheses is a later addition made by people to make it look like his brothers are against him. And when you go into Mark 3, you'll see there's another thing where Jesus is he's preaching, and the translation that we get today is that his brothers and his mother come to seize him because they think he's crazy. That's how it gets translated. But when you go back to the original Greek and you see what's actually being said there, the actual passage says that the people who are with him don't believe in him. So it actually says nothing at all about his family. And the better translation of that would be his disciples, because those are the people with him. In fact, his mother and his brother don't show up for about another 10 verses. So, but today, in almost all books, the translation for that is family. So what's going on? I think it's pretty clear that during the late first and the second centuries, that there are several Christian groups all over the place. One of the Christian groups is the group that is represented by Jesus' own family, that his brother James and subsequently his nephews and grandnephews have a sect. It's called the Ebionites, or the Poor Ones, and they are one of the early Christian groups. As a matter of fact, if you read the Acts and the letters of Paul, the Ebionites, or James's group, is really the most powerful group. After the sacking of Jerusalem in 70, the group begins to lose power, but they're still around for another 50 or 100 years, and it's pretty obvious also, reading Paul, that the Gentile groups are jealous of this group. Why? Because this is the group this is the dynasty. This is the group that, who should you be following? Should you be following this Paul's group, or should you be following the family of Jesus? Well, if you should be following the family of Jesus, they obviously have a prime position. So I think what's clearly going on here is that these rival Christian groups, of which there are many, are purposefully distorting the Gospels and changing them or inserting things in order to denigrate Jesus' family, in order to, it's like a marketing ploy, in order to get more adherents and therefore more dues for their group and to have less people going over to Jesus' family. There's a very good book by Jeffrey Butts, came out last year. It's called, I think, The Brother of James, and he goes into quite a lot of detail of how these things happened, and I definitely recommend that book to your listeners.
I think we probably should move on to the Essene issue, since we still have a lot of misconceptions, but I'll just tell the listeners to please go to James's great website, www.jesuspolice.com, in which he addresses all the other misconceptions, and there are many, or get his wonderful book, Jesus Who. But now, why don't we move to a lot of what your book is about, and that is Jesus, or the theology of Jesus, being from the Essene group. Could you tell us a bit about this, please?
In my methodology, as I was preparing the book, I didn't start out with any preconceptions. So I was going through Jesus' life stage by stage and trying to say, okay, what do we know, and where is there any truth, and what's the evidence? And I did this almost as isolated events. What do we know about his birth? What do we know about his childhood, his ministry, his personality, et cetera, et cetera? And I wasn't trying to develop any particular themes, and I thought after I solved these puzzles with each of these events, if there are any themes, the themes themselves will emerge, and that's exactly what happened with the idea that Jesus comes from an Essene family. The Essenes, as you know, and I'm sure your listeners know very well, were one of the preeminent religious groups in Israel at this time, and Josephus lists them as one of the 3 groups, and I guess Philo's got them as one of the 4 groups. Looks, from what we can understand, that they really came into existence around the 2nd or the 3rd century BC. They came because of what was going on with the high priest. The high priest originally should have been traditionally from the Zadok branch, and under the Maccabeans, they changed this. And so what was going on was that the Essenes revolted, apparently moved out to various communities like Qumran, etc., and then established their own religious group, with the goal being to someday oust the ruling bodies in Jerusalem and the temple, and to put back the Davidic king and the Zadok priesthood. We know between Josephus and Philo and a couple of things in Pliny and some other bits and pieces about them that they were not only in Iran, but in fact they were all over the area as far as Damascus, as south as Alexandria, and that there were thousands of these people that had a certain philosophy. And let me give you some examples of their philosophy, and you see if this sounds familiar to you. They practiced baptism, a certain kind of baptism. They believed in the end of times and eschatology. They believed in community of property. They believed in eating together. They were ascetics. They believed in a coming Messiah. They believed in the resurrection of the body. They believed that it wasn't sufficient when the kingdom of God would arrive. Being Jewish by itself was not sufficient to earn your way into heaven, that you had to be good. You had to follow the way. They believed that the world was was good and evil, the sons of light and the sons of darkness.
Yeah, it sounds very familiar. I mean, sounds even a bit like Paul, but it certainly sounds like John the Baptist. It seems he was in Essene, right?
Yeah, when you look at it, this is from all the historical work that I did, it looks to me as if John the Baptist was in Essene. It looks like he was about a couple of years older than Jesus. It's very clear that Joseph was in Essene, and I could go into some of the reasons for that. I think it was common for the Essenes to raise children and to keep them out there at Qumran and give them extensive training, which is what explains why Jesus had such extensive training. I think somewhere along the line, John the Baptist broke with the Essenes and went out on his own. I think that was because he believed that the Escalon, the end of times, was very close, and that there was no reason, to be out in the desert, that you had to get more people involved. And I think that's why he broke and he went out to the river. And I think Jesus was like a young cadet at the Essene school, and he had some misgivings himself when he saw John break. He later broke and also went away, became a disciple with John. And then I think just as John had envisaged the eschaton coming sooner and he went out the river, I think Jesus took it the next step, which was you just can't be out at a river waiting for people to come to you. You have to go out and preach it face to face. So I think he moved one step beyond that. But the core beliefs in both John's teaching and Jesus' teaching are almost identical to the Essenes. The Essenes had a 12-man ruling body. Jesus had 12 disciples. They had an inner core of 3 people, and Jesus has got, Peter, John, and James, his little inner core of 3 people. They had procedures for handling quarrels, and Jesus gives people procedures for handling quarrels. So it's almost everything about Jesus's practice, you can find the roots of that in the Essenes. Now,
don't you mention that they also called their wives virgins to a certain point, or
no,
it had to do when they mated? I'm sorry.
Oh, with the mating ritual. Actually, the Essene mating ritual. People think that the Essenes were monks, and that's true. Part of the Essenes, the most well-known group of the Essenes, were monks, but there were another group of Essenes who were allowed to have sex. I think they were called the lucky Essenes. Excuse the bad joke. They were a second kind of Essenes, and those were the Essenes who were related to either the Davidic line or the Zadoite line, because the Essenes believed someday when they would be back in power, they would reinstitute the kingly and the priestly traditional roles. Well, in order for that to happen, it meant that the people in the Davidic and the Zadoite lines had to reproduce. So those people in the Essenes, and Joseph would be from the Davidic line, who were Essenes, were allowed to reproduce. But they had a very funny marriage procedure, and they were allowed, they would get married, and once they were married, they could have sex only in December, and the reason for having sex in December, apart from saying Merry Christmas, was to be able to, which of course they didn't have
mistletoe.
Because
they had the mistletoe.
He's not born in December, so they were wrong about that.
Right.
But they had it in December so that the child could be born in September, because September was the month of atonement. And this was the holy month to be born in. Well, in order to ensure that the kid would be born in September, you could only have sex in December. So the tradition was get married, have sex in December, and once your wife became pregnant, you would then have the second marriage ceremony, which would happen in around March, and then the kid would be born in September. Now, that was done in order to ensure that you didn't get stuck with a woman who didn't reproduce. So if she didn't get pregnant, you could divorce her and then take another wife until somebody got pregnant, therefore ensuring the continuation of the line. And when you go back and you read the birth narratives, what seems most likely is that, in fact, Joseph and Mary were two hot little Jewish kids living in Galilee, and they couldn't wait. They had sex before December. So, and the result of that is the whole thing of Mary, how can I be with child, and all the upsets and the uproar is because, in fact, she is now pregnant before December, which means he's not going to be born in the month of Atonement, which kind of, for very religious Jews, which is what the Galileans were and what the Essenes were, this was a terrible thing to happen. Nowadays, it happens all the time. But in those days, amongst those people, that was considered a very sinful thing to do. And if you reread the birth stories and all of the stuff in there with that in mind, they become a lot more, a lot clearer. So in some senses, Jesus is an illegitimate child because he wasn't born in that precise manner in which it was prescribed according to the Essenes for him to be born. He's not born in September, and some people have posited, for example, that the reason James becomes the head of the Ebionites and such a powerful person, James is his younger brother, is that James goes through the process correctly. They're a little bit older, they're not quite so promiscuous, so James is born in the proper manner and therefore goes on to become the high priest of the Ebionites and to assume the mantle that theoretically Jesus would have assumed, but Jesus, having been a little bit askance and not having gone through it exactly by the numbers, would not have been an appropriate person for the formal title.
Speaking of James and the debate that has been going on, where do you stand on the mysterious teacher of righteousness that we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls? Do you think they're talking about Jesus, past Joshua, or James?
Well, you know, the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're written over a period of, I guess, about 200 or 300 years. And as far as I can tell, and I'm by no means an expert, and I rely on other people's opinions and their research in this area, but as far as I can tell, the teacher of righteousness is all written BC, considerably BC, like 100 years BC. So I don't think that they're talking about Jesus, although some parts of the Dead Sea Scrolls, in fact, are written post-Jesus, but the teacher of righteousness is pre-Jesus. And there was a very interesting book by Michael Weiss. I think it's called The Savior Before Jesus, or so. It's The Savior 100 years before Jesus, or something like that. And what he points out in that book is, he says who the teacher of righteousness is, he's an archetype that is developed that you can later understand Jesus by virtue of what that original Messiah, or the first Messiah, this book is called The Messiah. He says this teacher of righteousness sets the pattern which Jesus then later follows. And when you look at that pattern, there are lots of similarities, and although I had some problems with Weiss's book, I think basically he's on target there, that the teacher of righteousness is a prototype or an archetype that that later people fit into. But I don't think they're actually talking about Jesus per se.
Just so at least we mention the Gnostic so I don't get myself crucified, how do you think the Gospel of Thomas changed the scholarship on the search of the historical Jesus, or maybe some of the other Nag Hammadi scriptures?
The Gospel of Thomas is when it's so important to the study of the historical Jesus that in my book, the first two documents, if you're trying to find something out, where do you go? Do you go to your catechism? Do you go to your, et cetera, et cetera? The two documents I relied on most heavily and gave the most weight to were the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mark, because I think those were the two most authentic. And I think the Gospel of Thomas even more so, because it wasn't stepped on so many times as were the Christian documents, which were discovered, and then these guys are painting it their own way and transcribing and doing all kinds of stuff, so that what we get today is almost a pale image of what the originals were. The beauty of the Gospel of Thomas is here's something that was probably composed, if not in the 1st century, certainly in the 2nd century. I think the document itself is dated to the 4th century, the copies that we have, and then disappeared. So it's almost a prime document in terms of giving us an insight into what they said and how they said it and what they were thinking about. That's its first value was just a primary source. The second value, I think that's its major value. It has a second value, and that was supporting the hypothesis concerning the Q document, which again I'm sure your readers know that people posited a hypothetical document because there's stuff in Matthew and Luke that doesn't appear in Mark but appears in Matthew and Luke. People think that Matthew and Luke must have been sitting down with Mark and this other document, and it got called Q or Quell in German, and it's always been a hypothetical document. And there are some stuff in, I don't know if it's Papias or one of the early Christian, quote, fathers talks about, the oracles of the Lord, the sayings of the Lord. So you had a hypothetical Q document, you had a reference to the original Matthew being oracles, but all of this was all theory.
Oh, that was Papias, the sayings of Matthew or something like that.
Yeah, the original Matthew was theoretically, it wasn't the Matthew we see today, it was a sayings gospel, but no one ever saw it. Well, at least we can't find it, but it is referred to. Then all of a sudden, the Gospel of Thomas appears, and lo and behold, it's a sayings gospel. So, its second value, not just first value being a prime source, its second value is it validated the hypothesis or the belief or the search for a sayings gospel, that in fact there were sayings gospels, and here's one right here. So I think it's really valuable. Now, unfortunately, it's extremely difficult to interpret, and better people than me have spent their careers going through it, and I read this guy's interpretation and that guy's interpretation, and et cetera, and it's not so clear exactly what they're talking about. But I think it's extremely valuable, and it's particularly valuable when you find something in the Gospel of Thomas and find it somewhere else and see how it's been changed or not. That's a universe, and the Gospel of Thomas is a universe unto itself. Extremely valuable find.
Before we go, James, there's one that I missed, which I think is very important, and it will certainly make fundamentalists gasp the most. But you say that neither was Jesus was not only not nailed to a cross, but it's probably correct to surmise that he was even placed on a cross to begin with.
Yes, and this is maybe, apart from the way he looked, one of the extremely interesting and unexpected findings is how often Jesus is said to have been hung, not crucified. If you remember the other Jesus, Pantera, the guy who lived 100 BC, he's killed, but he's stoned to death and then hung. That's how he's killed. That's actually what the Jews did. The Jews didn't crucify people. Crucifixion wasn't a Jewish thing. They stoned them to death and then they would hang them. And, when you go through the Gospels, for example, the Acts, Paul says of Jesus, whom you had killed by hanging him on a tree. And Galatians says, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us, for it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. 1 Peter says, he himself carried up our sins in his body to the tree. Polycarp's letter to Philippians says, Jesus Christ who bore our sins in his body on the tree. And I could go on. Acts of John, Jesus is talking and he says, one hanged was I and yet not hanged. So there are, and many more, allusions to the fact that maybe he wasn't crucified at all, maybe he was hung. Really interesting stuff. I guess it depends if you believe that he was killed by the Romans, and there is some reason to believe that that's the case, then he probably was crucified. But if you believe he was killed by the Jews, and a good case can be made for that, then he was probably hung. And, in my own mind, I really haven't been able to resolve that. But I think it seriously questions whether or not he actually was crucified or possibly, in fact, he was hung. Of course, there are people in this Gnostics, particularly, who believe neither one of those happened. In fact, he escaped altogether, and there is a theory that it was Simon or someone else who was crucified, and he escaped completely. The theories about the death, and it's just not clear that he was crucified. I mean, maybe he was, but it's not 100% obvious that he was crucified.
And the Gospels, as you mentioned, is only one place in the Gospels where you actually Jesus mentions having his hands pierced, right?
Yeah, really only in John does it say that, and some people have, and it's also in John that he's pierced in the side, and many people have said by the time John gets around to writing his Gospel, the Jewish critics have all said nobody dies on the cross in 3 hours, which is, in some of the Gospels he's on it for 3 hours, some of the Gospels he's on it for 6 hours. But in either case, it generally took 2 to 3 days to die on a cross. So by the time John is writing, the criticism has already come up, well, when you took him down from the cross, he wasn't really dead because nobody dies after 3 hours. Therefore, what you call a resurrection is simply a resuscitation. Jesus, he fainted, they took him down, he got revived, and the resurrected Christ is simply Jesus now alive, walking around. So to counter that argument, many scholars say this is what the Gospel of John is doing. John now tells you, oh no, they nailed him up there, and they stuck him with a thing, and he was surely dead. So the guy they took down is really dead. And that kind of apologetics, you see that in Matthew, you see that in John, where in Matthew, for example, they say the guards were bribed in order to say that the stone hadn't been removed, and therefore, and the Jews to this day still tell that scandal. So you see in Matthew, and again you see in John, this kind of writing to answer the criticisms that are out there, and it may just be that the whole idea of Jesus being pierced and Jesus being nailed come from John's apologetic, because it was not the custom of Romans on individual crucifixions. Romans tended to tie the people up there. For mass they had to do 2,000 people, they tended to nail them. But if you read descriptions of crucifixions, the mass crucifixions, people are nailed. The individual crucifixions, people are tied. So they're not nailed, and so John would be inconsistent with what we know about how the Romans crucified.
And they didn't even use crosses. They just used, T-shaped structures to do it that weren't very high, maybe the size of a person?
Yeah, it was T-shaped. If you've ever tried, I don't know, if you try to build a cross, and you'll find it's almost impossible to do because you just can't get that cross beam in there very easily. What they did, and this is, it's well known, and in all the early portraits show a cross is simply a T-shape. You take the vertical thing, you nail it into the horizontal thing, and that's what a cross is. It's a T-shaped cross, which is called a tau. It's not the cross that we know of today. Catholics didn't decide that that was the cross until about 400 A.D. But in fact, everybody crucified, all the early crosses were T's. And the people, just as you said, were just a few inches above the ground. And one reason for that was part of the punishment was that dogs would tear at their flesh. That was all part of the... the Romans were a little sadistic. They liked to let you hang there for days. The birds would come down and eat you. The dogs would eat you. And that was the whole idea. It was to scare everybody and to show them this is the worst kind of a possible death. Somehow, all those things, got changed in the mythology that's created in the next 300 or 400 years by the early Christian church. It becomes a regular cross, and he's nailed, and a lot of what I've called silliness comes into the story of Jesus. But if you go back to the times, in those times, people were crucified on a T, and they were tied, not nailed.
So what else do you have in the works? Are you working on another book, another Jesus book, or?
Yeah, I originally started out wanting to do a book about Jesus' personality. What was going on inside his mind? Who was he? And as I started doing that research, I found all these errors by all these people, almost all these. Everybody who's ever written a book about Jesus has got all these errors in them, that I thought, oh my goodness, first I got to figure out who he was and what the facts are, because I can't go trying to do a personality profile on somebody I don't even know the basic facts on. So although my original intent was this book on Jesus' personality, it ended up being Jesus Who, because I just had to get the record straight for who this guy was. When was he born? Who's his family? What was his education? Etc. I think I now have a pretty good handle on who he was, and I've started the second phase, which is to explore now the personality dynamics. I've got a little bit about the personality in the current book, but this next book will be exclusively, given that this is the person, this is now the personality.
Well, we certainly look forward to it, and thank you very much for coming on Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis. For the listeners, make sure you go to JesusPolice.com, where there's loads of facts, and Dr. James Gardner even allows you to give your input if you'd like. So it's not... So it's a good place to go. And thank you very much for taking your time today.
Well, thanks a lot for having me. I'm very privileged to have been in such good company. Your program has really good scholars on, scholars whose books I've used, and I'm very pleased that you invited me on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
I've witnessed firsthand the power of ideas. I've seen people kill in the name of them, and die defending them. But you cannot kiss an idea, cannot touch it, or hold it. Ideas do not bleed, they do not feel pain, they do not love.
I am so alone.
None of this is real.